Hey everyone, so I'm gonna try something a little different again. Recently I've been watching some of Stephen J. Brown's videos detailing his experiences from the 70s and on. Go give his videos a watch, I'll have a link to his channel in the description. While my experiences were in the mid-2000s, it's a given that they won't be quite as interesting as the insanely versatile and unpredictable motive power of the 70s through 90s, but still an interesting period compared to now, nonetheless. Several BNSF's former Santa Fe units still wore the war bonnet scheme, not many of Union Pacific's units had the flag or the winged shield yet, and Conrail Blue was still just about a daily sight on the NS. Anyway, here's a retrospective on June 25th, 2005. Summer 2005. I was 10 years old, had just gotten out of the 4th grade, and more importantly to the video, had already been a rail buff since I was very little. Up to this point, though, I'd only ever seen trains in passing, usually while riding around in the car, on walks in my hometown, along the NS Frankfurt district, or, where my interest began in the first place, visiting my paternal grandmother, who lived a block from the tracks in Wabash, Indiana, until she passed in 2002. I'd never actually spent a whole day along the tracks up to that point. At the time, my dad had a coworker who did some rail photography, and had uploaded several shots to railpictures.net. My dad's main hobby at the time happened to be photography. I had just recently happened to pick up the same hobby using my dad's previous camera, and one of my strongest interests happened to be trains, especially those in Wabash, the town my dad grew up in. So it was decided. We would have a whole day of rail photography in Wabash. We arrived at Wabash the morning of June 25th, 2005. Our first stop was at the Wabash City Park, where I had been a few times before then, and, being the lifelong rail buff I was amazed at the park and how it was split in half by the NS Huntington District running right through the middle. It was always a little ironic to me for somewhere intended to be a nice, relaxed place to hang out, but then again Wabash's historic Carnegie Library is located right next to the tracks too. Anyway, having grown up down the block from the park, my dad knew a shortcut or two in the park to get up to the tracks. So we climbed a little hill up the track grade, and arrived at our first stop of the day, next to the milepost 189.6 signal. It didn't take long, maybe just a few minutes, before we heard the sick and weak horn of BNSF C40-8W number 890 off in the west. Not much later, at 9:39 a.m., this short eastbound grain train came rolling by. Also, for reference through the remainder of the video, I'll be showing the shots my dad took first, and then follow up with my pretty amateurish shots of the same trains. At the time, my dad was shooting with an Olympus C740 with 3 megapixels and 10 times optical zoom, which, to be honest, 10 times zoom was pretty good for the time. And I was shooting with his previous camera, and my family's first digital camera, an Olympus D520. Anyway, we'd been told that morning traffic in Wabash was pretty heavy, and that seemed to be the case, because according to the file properties, only 15 minutes later, at 9:55 a.m., a westbound auto boxcar train with a UP-9 and Conrail Blue-8 wide cab rolled through. The heat and humidity of the day are a lot more visible in the shots of this train. And just another measly 18 minutes later, at 10:13, a westbound auto train came by with BNSF-9 4015 and an unknown NSGE. Next, we decided to shift locations and stopped by the east outskirts of town along East Hill Street. That was where we pulled over and decided to make our next spot the Huntington District bridge that passes over the NS Marion branch. The next train involved quite a bit more standing around. I remember getting a little bored waiting. Surely enough, though, about 50 minutes after the last train, around 11, another westbound auto came into town with UP-9 number 9603 and UP B40-8 1818 of Southern Pacific Heritage pulling. After a little more waiting around, we heard a distant horn again, probably around 11:30. It took unexpectedly long before more signs of a train made themselves known, but eventually the headlights of UP SD70M number 3876 appeared from the other end of the cut on the Marion branch. This particular train had an interesting assortment of power, from its UP SD70M leader, to LMX B39-8E number 8577, to UP Standard Cab-89126, to an unknown NS C39-8. I can be seen here, plugging my ears and waving. Here are a few of my shots. In particular, I always liked this one, with the Ford LTD waiting at the crossing with the old flasher signals and CP cylindrical hoppers. Had a nice vintage feeling to it. Back to the Huntington District, about 14 minutes after that northbound passed by on the Marion, what I assume was an NS-20T headed over the bridge with NS-99757 and GP50 7033 trailing. Now, with 6 trains already captured in just over 2 hours, and the clock about to strike noon, we headed over to Penguin Point for lunch. While we were over there, we heard a train or two pass through town. My maternal grandparents lived on the other side of town at the time, so we also tried to drop in for a short visit, but they weren't home. So we decided to head back trackside. We waited for a short bout at the Olive Street crossing, but nothing seemed to come along. We headed further west along Old US 24, where we came across the overpass above the Huntington, and decided to wait atop the bridge. By this time the sun and humidity were on full blast, and traffic had slowed down for the afternoon. We sat in the van with the AC blowing for a while, and my dad would step out from time to time to have a look down the tracks. At one point, at 1:52, a light appeared, but it was just a maintenance of way truck, which was a good indicator as to why traffic had slowed down, and of course, didn't make traffic in the future seem very likely either. We continued to wait in the van, my dad continued to step out to check, and eventually, as the time approached 2:30, he signaled me over. That was when we caught an NS-21T with Conrail Quality Blue SD50 number 5430 and an unknown NS-9 pulling. Another hot, humid hour of waiting in the AC, and both of us checking occasionally, ended at 3:34 when we heard an eastbound blowing for the crossing in nearby Rich Valley, just around the bend from the 24 overpass. Along came an auto train with SD60 6595 and Horsehead GP40-2 3031. By this time, we decided to head back into town and once again try our first spot of the day by the park. A mere 25 minutes later, at 3:59, Solo NS-9 9052 brought a westbound Triple Crown through town. Just 15 minutes later, at 4:14, a pair of NS-9s with 9477 leading also rolled west through Wabash. One note I'd like to mention is that 9477 most likely had a Leslie RS3L at the time. So, after that train had cleared, my dad asked if I wanted to go home yet. I said we should wait on just one more. Little did I realize how good an idea that was, because 25 minutes later, at 4:39, one last westbound rolled by with Warbonnet C40-8W number 823 leading, and an unknown NS-9 and Conrail Blue SD70 trailing. The unit already looked pretty rough at the time, and continued to fade during its run on the BNSF. Canadian National eventually picked up the unit and renumbered it to 2173, as seen in this 2012 James Gardner photo. The unit had a fairly short new life on the CN, and caught through the lens of James Gardner again in 2020, it's seen here awaiting scrap. You could definitely say that June 25th, 2005 was a turning point in my hobby as a rail buff. I'd be interested in trains all my life up to then, but this was the first day I ever spent most of my time trackside and got to see so many trains up close. In retrospect, it's clear now that the Huntington District was a lot busier back then. And even clearer that I was one impatient kid if I got bored when there were 6 trains in under 2.5 hours. I've been in the hobby long enough now to know just how much waiting we have to do, especially those of us who still don't have a scanner. Anyway, it was a day that stands out in my memory and sparked a whole new subgenre of the hobby. 2005 and the following years saw a number of other rail fanning days for my dad and me. And while I pretty much just made this video for myself and just for fun, if there's enough interest in this one, I might make a few more. For now, I'll be back to posting whatever I happen to catch on my spontaneous and inconsistent schedule. Thanks for tuning in to this retrospective.